what we want to do this morning is to say, looking at this, remember my two questions of yesterday? What did you hear? What does it mean? Okay, so it's always good to think, what is this saying, but what does it mean? I think this is one of the great things about being a human being. We don't just take in facts or observations. We always interpret. So we always have our mental representation of things. And it's important that this mental representation be true. I often quote an example. I also quote European ones, but this was, I think, a very good example of a mental representation. It was a guy who works for Scripture Union in France, who worked for many years in the Ivory Coast. And he told us this story at a conference, how he was in a bush taxi in the Ivory Coast in Africa. And he thought the driver was really driving too fast. So he said, look, I know you've got to earn your living. I will give you more money if you drive more slowly. And the driver said, well, why do you want me to drive more slowly? And Charles Daniel said, because I think if you drive more slowly, there is less chance of us having an accident. The driver said, oh, that's nothing to do with it. If someone has cast a spell on us, we'll have an accident. If they haven't, we won't. It's nothing to do with speed. That was his mental representation of life. So in one sense, we always have this mental representation. But what we want to do as Christians is to see, as far as we can, as honest as we can, the situation, and then to interpret it in the light of the Scriptures, in the light of Christ, the light of our ministry, to say, what does this mean for what we're doing today? Okay? So you've understood. I'll try to explain it quite quickly. Most of you have read this already, but it'd be good just to get a reminder. So first of all, there's the introduction, just to remember that in Europe, the influence, the religious influence is that we have more in the north, the Protestant influence, more in the south, the Catholic. Some places are half and half, Catholic, Protestant. In the east, it's the Orthodox, and there is a small area which is majority Muslim. You probably know that, but it's interesting to remember that does influence the way people think. Just to give you an example, those who come from an Orthodox country, where Orthodoxy is very much, how can I say, twinned with the idea of nationhood at the same time. You are an Orthodox of this country, so the nationhood and the orthodoxy go together. And I was in a meeting once where I was ministering at the time, and I had a meeting with the Catholic priest and the Orthodox priest. And the Orthodox priest really turned to the Catholic priest in great anger and said, why don't you make the people who are Catholic go to your church? For him, he could almost oblige the people to go because they were, this was a Syrian Orthodox, because they were Syrians, because they're Orthodox, they had to go. And the Catholic priest was trying to say, well, it's a question of choice. I can't actually make people go to the church in the same way. So the religious background does have an influence on the way that people think. Another thing that Greg talked about is the Caesaro-papism, but what he means by that is that the church and the state are together. In 1800, there are only 2 or 3 countries in the whole of Europe, and the biggest one was France, where the state and religion were separated. By 1900, this has spread. In today's world, state religion is pretty a minority thing, and even in the countries like the UK and so on, I don't know how much you would say that it is a state religion. Officially it is, but I don't know how much influence that actually has on the way people think. So that is a big change in the last couple of 100 years, that for centuries, the church and the state worked together. The divine right of kings. The king said, I am there by God's will, so you can't make a revolution. And in 1789, the French forgot that and made a revolution. The political background for almost, 45 years, Europe was divided into two, between the West and the Centre and East, between the more capitalist democratic West and the Soviet East. That also still has some influence. I'm not at all an expert on this, but when I've been to countries from the former Eastern Bloc, they tell me, for example, that the concept of leadership, even today, is affected by the fact that the Soviet system stressed a certain type of leadership or didn't want people taking initiatives, for example. And there's still an economic disparity between, this is the average monthly salary in Central and Eastern Europe, 530 euros a month, whereas in the rest of Europe, over 2,000. So it's a big difference. And that also influences the money available and the way you consider doing ministry. Although, of course, it can also be sometimes more expensive in the rest of Europe. Another indicator, which is quite interesting, is that the whole concept of same-sex marriage in Europe, it was very much on the Western side, and the former Eastern Bloc countries have not gone in that direction. Again, there is a certain conservatism in the East on social issues, which we don't have. On the other hand, if you, in the Western Europe today, try to say a word about same-sex marriage, and at the moment we're going through a whole debate on bioethics in France. For 6 months we had regional, local consultations, and the majority of people didn't want, how do you say it in English, surrogate motherhood and things like that. And yet, as soon as it goes to Parliament, it's immediately a big majority for, although the population weren't quite so in favour of it. So, the first key cultural trend is religious issues, and it's what you might call unbelief. The notion of atheism, which in 1900 was a very, very small number of people, less than 2 million people claimed that they were atheists. And interestingly enough, I wrote a book on atheism in French, and it wasn't until the 18th century that someone actually claimed to be an atheist as such, in using the word and the concept. So it's a fairly recent idea. People try to explain the world without God. God is the prime mover, as Voltaire would say, he set it up and then it's just sort of running like a clock. But it wasn't until the 18th century that people claimed really to be atheists. But today, you have 130 million people in Europe who would claim to be atheists. It's a difficult figure because every survey comes with different figures, because it's a mixture of atheists, agnostics, don't knows, and so on. And according to the way the question is asked, you get different figures. But the basic trend is there, that in some countries, if you opt out of a religion like a Catholic, they're automatically put into that category. Whereas in other countries where there's no state religion like we are, I have met quite a lot of people who say they are Catholics but don't believe that God exists. It's a difficult concept to get in, but people have actually said that to me and don't see any contradiction in that at all. Just to put this into some kind of perspective, again, I talk about France. It was decided about 5 years ago, I think, to try to put the figures together between Catholics and Protestants to find out what actually people were doing as compared to what they might believe or something. So they did a survey based on the fact, do you go to church at least once a month? And the answer for 65 million French were just over 3 million Catholics. That's all. Out of 60-something million, go to church once a month. From the Protestant side, we're about 750,000, of which about 700,000 will be evangelicals. So the difference between Catholics and Protestants in France is about a quarter evangelical compared to the number of people who are practicing Catholics. No one would have said that 50 years ago. It's quite extraordinary. Another thing is the growth of liberal Christianity. This is quite a famous quotation from Rudolf Bultmann, you've probably heard elsewhere, that belief in the miracles in the New Testament has no place in a world which uses electric lights. That's Bultmann who said that. And in one sense, what's trying to happen is, and that's why the picture's on the left, people have got their foot like in two boats. One is the boat of belief, and the other is the boat of the context we're in, the Enlightenment belief. And these boats are sort of getting more and more separated, and so what do you do? And one way is to go into liberal Christianity, and some people in Europe who have in the past claimed to be evangelicals have abandoned that and moved more into the liberal way of thinking. Greg says the growth of liberal Christianity. I'm not sure I'd say the growth, because in general, the more liberal churches don't have many people going to them. Like I gave the quotation just now, 750,000 Protestants in France, most of which are evangelicals, because although the more liberal, Reformed and Lutheran churches, who are not totally but quite largely liberal in France, very few people go, in fact, to them. They're losing committed membership, let's say. Another key shift is the shift of religion from the public to the private sphere. In other words, people will say, you've got your church, your meeting place, you can do your thing, freedom of religion, no problem, but don't bring it into the public sphere. We want to be tolerant, but tolerance doesn't mean that we accept everything that everyone says and we try to respect them. Tolerance means that not to harm someone else, don't speak about what you say. So tolerance is not just you agree that other people don't have the same ideas, but forces you not to say what you think, not to be thought of as, and this is the word hate, if you like, so the word is phobia, you would be homophobic or something. No one thinks they're Christophobic, in fact they are. And also the decreasing interest in organized institutional religion. So the membership of the Church of Scotland from 1966 to 2014 dropped from 1,200,000 to 380,000. What that means is, I don't know if in your country people say it like this, but certainly in my country they do. They would make a difference between religion and spirituality. Does that ring a bell with you or not? Yeah. So they'd say, I can be spiritual and I can believe in spirituality. And interestingly enough, at least two of the top French philosophers today, who are atheists, both say that they believe in spirituality and have written books on it. They don't mean spirituality like I do, but they want to use the word. The names are Luc Ferry and André Comte-Sponville. And they both have written books on being spiritual atheists, which is quite the opposite of the so-called new atheists in the English-speaking world. So spirituality, that's great. But the point is that spirituality is personal and not institutional. You can be spiritual without ever going to a church or even believing in God. But as soon as you're in an institution, this is thought of as being something in the postmodern world which is likely to take away your personal freedom. So you don't want that. And if you're in an institution, you'll want to impose this on other people. Whereas if you're just spiritual, that's fine. And the fact that Islam is the second fastest growing religion in Europe. Well, I looked in Greg's thing, I never found which was the fastest one. So, Chris, you read it and you see it. What does he say is the fastest one? It's not in the document.
It's unbelief.
It's unbelief. Okay, if you call that a religion, it's unbelief. Okay. So again, it's the fastest growing religion in Europe. I don't know how this works out in other countries, but certainly as far as I'm concerned, because obviously we all come from our situation, not very many French people become Muslims. It's not the French, it's immigration which is making the number of Muslims. If a French person wanted to change religion, they're more likely to be going in the direction of Buddhism, because this is being very Zen. It's being very there are no Buddhist sort of churches in the same way. You can be Buddhist over your Sunday breakfast, eating your croissant and drinking your coffee without having to do anything else. So that's fine. But the fact that Islam is there influences the way in which the population and the state look at religion in general. And that's the problem we have. Because as far as we are concerned, the outward appearance of what you wear or when you eat or what you eat is not important. Even in the New Testament, when Paul discusses this, he says for the meat sacrificed to idols, the important thing is your relationships. What's this going to change on relationships with people? So when reports have come out, what they call the Observatory of Secularism or Laicity made a big report on religion in the university, and all they could talk about was, can we organize exams when there isn't a holy day, or what do we do about people wanting to eat in a Jewish way or a Muslim way or something. And the National Council of Evangelicals met with the person who made the report, and we said, well, we think the real question is freedom of speech. Can we or can't we, in the university, talk about what we believe? This is important to us. And it's interesting, last year I was asked to be part of a round table in the political network to talk about our situation in France. And they were talking about people, for example, in some countries who were suspended from their work because they were wearing a cross or something like this. And in one case at least, the judge said, there is nothing in the New Testament that says that you must wear a cross. So it's not an obligatory thing. So it's quite right for the employer to say you can't, because this is not the essential part of being a Christian. But if he argued in that way, what is the essential thing of being a Christian is to speak about Jesus and do witness to Jesus. That is the essential thing. And the only two times in Acts where they talked about civil disobedience was when they were forbidden to speak about Jesus, and the apostles said, must we obey man or God? But so I think our big struggle in Europe is not to defend religious freedom, but to defend freedom of speech. So is Islam a threat or is unbelief a threat? It depends what we're thinking about. I think personally that public opinion is influenced by the fact that several hundreds of people in France have been killed by Islamic terrorists in the last 5 years. So this becomes part of your life. You get on a train, you go into a supermarket, people ask, there's people want to look in your bags to see if you've got a bomb or something, you just live with that. On Easter Day last year, I didn't ask for it, the government sent 4 soldiers with machine guns to stand outside my church. And I felt very unhappy about that, but I mean, the government wanted to protect our church, so there were these guys standing on the corner of the street with machine guns, and we were singing about the resurrection. It was quite surreal in a sense. So that public opinion is one thing, and then you've got what the state thinks, and the state fears, at least in our situation, what they're called communitarism. I could explain this at length, but I won't. That in French and possibly Latin countries, what they want is a direct relationship between the citizen and the state. So, for example, and people forget this, what they call the Declaration of Human Rights, which came from the French Revolution, in France is called the Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights. You have the word citizen with it as well. You as a citizen have your freedom. So as soon as a group meet together, you are seen almost automatically as a community which may be putting into question what the state thinks. And so to give an example, there's been a lot of debate in France whether Muslim women can wear their veils and so on. And generally, it's not allowed in a lot of situations. Whereas in other more Nordic countries, the thought is, this is the Muslim community, let's help them to integrate. But the idea of community, in French, you would never talk about the homosexual community or the Muslim community, because this would be seen as a group of people who are setting themselves out as separate from the other citizens. So you have these different ways of thinking. So that is why Islam is seen as something which is like a state within the state, or a sort of a cancer or something which is there. But that's our situation. Okay, let's go on to the second series of cultural trends, is moral issues. The first one we mentioned already, increased liberalization on ethical issues, euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and so on. Also, the decline of the traditional family structure. So this was figures for 2012, in which it's live births outside of marriage. I know it's not very clear there, but on the whole, Southern Europe is 29%, Western Europe 42%, Nordic Europe 54%. So 1 child in 2 is born outside of marriage. This doesn't mean that it's a single mother, that people can be living together, for example. Okay. I remember, this is one of these little things that you hear. I remember telling my neighbor when I was in the suburbs of Paris that my daughter was getting married, and she said, "Congratulations, you're going to be a grandfather." That was her her immediate reaction. It's amazing. Social problems, suicide, alcohol, drugs, human trafficking. One figure there is that drinkers between 15 and 19, 84% in Europe, 46% in the world. I would maybe relativize that a little bit, because I think you have to make a difference between what is called binge drinking, when people go and drink a lot, which is often the case in some of the, like in UK or some countries, or in France, where it'd be quite acceptable for someone who's 16 or 18 to have a glass of wine with a meal. It's not the same issue at all for me. And I would say the same thing for suicide. I think it's interesting that in Greg's document, but it's not there, he shows that there's a higher rate of suicide, I think, in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. My son, who is a doctor, says the explanation is, in Northern Europe you don't mind saying it, in Southern Europe you cover it up. So the figures may not be quite as different as they say. But obviously increased materialism, consumerism, The people live well. I don't know if it's if it's a factor, but I notice every time that I go to a wedding, for example, you know, the wedding list, you know, the young couple are going to live in fantastic comfort, you know, from the beginning. But when I was a young married man, my bookcase was some bricks with some some planks across, for example. We didn't expect to have everything straight away. And maybe this has an influence. We were talking about this with someone yesterday, that I saw figures given by IFES Europe, which showed that in today's world, people leaving the faith, it's not so much in high schools a few years ago or at university, but now when they finish, they graduate, they get a job, they got money, they can travel, and they sort of begin to take their distance from the church. And so it's a kind of consumerism, materialism that is a enemy, in a sense, more than we possibly think. And growing individualism. They talk about one-person households in Europe, 31% in the whole of Europe. They talk about the capitals, and I can confirm on the second picture, central Paris is very clearly defined because we've got a sort of motorway, the périphérique goes around. We call it central Paris. 2.5 million people. More than 50% live on their own. We're not talking families. More than 50% live alone of those 2.5 million people. So there's a lot of individualism. And in today's world, when you say, for example, I don't know if it's like that in your country, in the past you say, well, this young couple are living together, not married. Now they're not living together because each one wants their home, but they're still, they say, we are a couple, but they don't live in the same house, on the same flat. And these are trends that we are with. Okay, so liberalization, family structure declining, social problems, materialism, consumerism, individualism. I don't know how much of that is only concerning Europe. I have heard, but I can't, I've got no objective reason to say it, but it was, I read in a book somewhere that the biggest group which are absent from our churches is what? It's not Islam. The biggest group absent from our churches are couples living together, not married, with children. It's the biggest, that is the biggest social group which don't come to our churches with children. Couples living together without being married and who have got children are the biggest group because they feel a bit judged because they're not married, and yet they've got children, so they're in a kind of stable relationship. That's the biggest group not in our churches. I don't know if you would confirm that subjectively, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. So what do? We have to ask the question. Do we want, first of all, to say, you must get married before you can come to our church? How welcoming are we? I think they're big questions in Europe. How we welcome people, but without losing what we believe, but being welcoming at the same time. It's a big question, I think. Okay, I'll go on. There are some other social, political issues. I'm not going to spend quite so much time as there. An aging population, declining birth rate. So we should think in terms, I think, in revitalizing churches, not just, although it's important, not just young people, but how we also reach out to older people as well, because there are more and more older people around. And so if we expect them to come and dance with the drums, they might not want to. So we have to think of that. High levels of corruption in public life. Well, they say that's more in Central and Eastern Europe. I wouldn't say that so much for where I live. I don't think there is corruption, but I wouldn't say a high level of corruption myself in Western Europe. Unemployment, though, is. That's a very, very difficult issue according to the countries. And if they say the under 25s, the 53% of the under 25s in Spain unemployed, that's quite terrible. I don't know how you deal with that. But in one sense, I mean, people talk about this and it can be linked to nationalism, but in one sense, even within a country, this happens. That people go to where the work is and will leave certain areas where there isn't work to go to where there is. So it's, in one sense, it's normal, but it does make it difficult. Like a rural church finds it more difficult to have young leadership because there's not the work in the rural area. They're going to go more to the town or the city. Talked about the impact of immigration. There's lots of different impacts. Greg talked about the integration of Central Eastern Europe into the West. Well, sense of growing danger from resurgent Russia, the internet generation. There's lots of different things there. I don't think we'll spend the time to talk about it. I think possibly the key social issue is the digital generation that is being. I've recently seen it written in a few places that the average person today spends 5 hours looking at their mobile phone per day in Europe. And I've seen this. If you're in Paris and you get on the metro, the first reaction, you get your phone, have a look. And I quoted to I think it was our year-round mentoring group. I thought it was very sad. It was in St. Valentine's Day, and we had a church Bible study that evening, and I was walking along the street, and there were some restaurants, and obviously on Valentine's Day, you're inviting. There was this young couple sitting in the window of this restaurant, each one looking at their phone, and I thought, they should be looking in the eyes of the other person. But perhaps they were talking to each other on the phone. Okay, this was the last part. Evangelicals in secular Europe. A minority status in most places. We're thought of as being and we are a minority. Certain people see evangelicalism as a cult. We went through that in France about 15 years ago and have come out on the other side now, fortunately. We're no longer seen like that, but there was a period where it was very difficult. Is there a lack of evangelical interdenominational cooperation? Depends on the country, depends on the context. Continuing with Greg's analysis, inadequate models of Christian leadership, partly through the influence of communism and Catholicism, as in both cases. For example, in Catholicism, each parish will have its priest, and he is the ultimate authority, and the rest just come and listen, or whatever. It's not a question of leadership. And possibly, as I mentioned before, the Soviet system didn't encourage initiative either. Lack of integration of faith and life. In other words, we're disciples 24 hours a day, and how much do we teach and help people to be Christians in every situation they're in? I mean, I remember reading an article that said a church would pray for the Sunday school teacher, but not pray for the school teachers who are with their kids all day, 5 days a week. And so, how do we integrate faith and life? The influence of migrant populations, positively and negatively. Negatively, often bringing prosperity gospel. And so I can sometimes understand why the people want to be conquerors, they want to be winners or whatever, quoting Nigerian church slogans. So that is the negative side, but at the same time, less timid in witnessing. I sometimes see, for example, a black person standing up in the metro in Paris and sort of preaching to the people. I don't know how much they're positive. I remember once a guy was doing that, and the two men sitting opposite me were sort of mocking, and I was with my son, and we just leant forward and said, actually, we agree with him. And they were quite shocked that we should say that. But there is a question, at least in the countries with a lot of immigration, to help these people who are very committed Christians to contextualize like we Europeans had to do going to Africa, and they have to recontextualize to us. I remember an African pastor saying to me, I'm going to tell you, David, why French churches aren't growing. Okay, tell me. You don't dance enough during the services. Okay. Although, just as a parenthesis, and I'll say this because I think it's important too, since I was a pastor of a multicultural church, that the meaning of dancing for an African is not the same as for a European. So an African dances to internalize what they're thinking, whereas a European, it's to externalize what they're thinking. So in my multicultural church, we had to make it clear to people that if the Africans were dancing, the equivalent gesture for a European was possibly to close your eyes and bow your head. It meant the same thing, but wasn't the same action. And I just throw that out. It's interesting to know that sort of thing. Evangelical drift towards liberal theology, question mark, and consumerism affecting missions and generosity. You got more money, but you spend it on yourself. Now that's sort of Greg's summary of it. Okay, this is just the general context. Maybe we'd thought of all this before, but I think it's interesting to get it all in one go. Ever since I was a young Christian, which was quite a few years ago, I never considered I was anything else but in a minority. And I think that we have to read sometimes analyses and books coming from the United States who will still talk about the States being a Christian country. I bought a book at the bookstore yesterday, a disciple of John Piper. It was a book produced in 2015 who talked about the United States as a Christian country. I don't think many people in Europe would ever say, my country is a Christian country. So we are used to this being a minority. So I think for me it's just the fact. But the question is, how can we have some kind of impact on society? And so I would tend to say that most of what we do, and we're going to hear more after the coffee break, is on a relational level. And we have to be on a relational level. Most people become Christians through relationships and so on. But if we don't have some kind of public status, then there will be a certain suspicion. And so to give an example, the last two places I've been a pastor, I have insisted, and sometimes I had to insist very strongly, that there be a link to our church website on the municipal website. Because I say, we are a public place of worship. We are a public meeting place. We are part of this city. So it's normal that people should be able to find us from the municipal website. And in the end, they agreed. It's just one example. Okay, my time is up, but I'll just come back to the little conclusion that I wanted to say, is that being I can't remember how we started this, about change. This film brought about change. That everything is changing all the time. I'm changing as I live my life. Society is changing. God's plans are sort of unrolling, if you like. So why should the church be the only thing that doesn't change? That's how often I introduce revitalization in France. The church has to change because everything else is changing. It doesn't mean that we don't believe what we believe, but the way we do it has to change. Otherwise, we will become totally unreadable to the people around us.